Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SIG-CLI meeting. This is January 31st, Wednesday, 2018. So let's get started. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So the first topic on our agenda is deprecate kubectl scale job. I don't know who.
That will be me.
Okay.
Hi, this is Mate from Red Hat. So this was brought up last week over this week. So we moved the entire scaling over to the server, and that means that currently there's a generic scale client, and every resource that wants to be scaled actually exposes a scale endpoint. And that's fine for a majority of resources, such as deployments, daemon sets, or in general, all those long running. Unfortunately, and I must admit to the mistake of introducing the scaling capability for jobs was done back in the days when jobs were being introduced. And the problem with jobs is that scaling jobs modifies the only possible field that can be modified, which is a parallelism, which means this is the number of pods running a job at any given point in time.
Okay.
And the problem with this approach is that job by definition is supposed to finish at some point in time, which means that towards the end of the job, if you set parallelism to a certain level, which will be less than the number of pods that needs to run, then the parallelism will never reach the desired number, which leads to problems. I linked the two PRs. The first one is where we are moving towards the generic scaler, and the other one was where we introduced the scale endpoint for jobs. So initially I started with presenting in the status the information about the spec for the job that was just modified, which both Jordan and David said will be wrong. And I was having lengthy discussion with both David and Jordan about possible approaches. And at the end of the day, we agreed that jobs per se is not able to scale properly due to the problems that I explained a minute ago. That's why we would like to be able to deprecate the scale operation for job. What we currently will do is that the majority of scale operations will be using the generic client, and that's fine. But in case of a job, we will be currently, for 1.10, we would implement a warning that this is a deprecation warning, and probably in 1.11 or 1.12, we would entirely remove the functionality for scaling a job.
I have a question. One of the challenges with scaling jobs you mentioned was that it sounded like it's not safe to do it in certain ways, or certain scales aren't safe.
The problem is towards the end of the job, because if you set a number, the scale which is translated then to parallelism, let's say we would set a parallelism to 5, but there are only 3 more pods that need to run the job. There will never be created 5 pods just because you defined a scale of 5.
If we think
there's
about it,
only 3 of them.
if we think about it in the other direction, in order to be scalable, there are a few pieces of information that must be present and a few semantics that must be obeyed, right? If you look at the scale object, it expects to have a desired scale number and a current scale number. And it expects to have a pod selector that can show you the current number of pods, right? And that's what the scale contract is about. And the job API can't fulfill that, right? It can't say that I can change my desired and then I'll be able to see the result via this pod selector. It's not a thing that jobs can guarantee, and so they don't match the interface.
Can you detect when you can and can't do that and then just fail if you can't? Or is that like we can't detect?
It's not just the immediate action that you're taking, right? So the immediate action is the update case, right? But an API like Scale has both an update and a get. And the get semantic cannot be respected either. Because when I get the current state, and desired state will rarely match, and the pod selector will rarely give me back the set of pods that I'm expecting.
And so the Scale API has a contract where the expected and desired state are expected to converge. And since job doesn't have that semantic, it can't implement the Scale API. Is that?
Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it.
Yeah.
Okay, so this means like Scale was always broken, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And I can admit to introducing that one probably by mistake back at the day when jobs were introduced.
The verb sounds very similar for a job, but
Yeah.
the fact that we were never able to create the actual Scale endpoint, I think now going through it, we can see that it doesn't actually match, and we wouldn't allow something else.
I see. And if we wanted something in this future, we'd introduce like a new API sub-resource, which is like parallelism with different semantics.
If we thought that it was a generic concept, yes, we could. I don't think it would be Scale, obviously, but yeah.
Right. It would be a different API. Okay. So what we need to do for that, right, is make probably the least disruptive to customers would be to deprecate that, leave it in, let the code be a little bit messy for release, and then take it out.
Yes, that's basically the approach that we would like to see happening.
All right.
We'll go ahead and do it. One thing I wasn't sure of is how to actually indicate it on the command. Most of the commands we have deprecated have not been, if you pass this argument to a command, it's deprecated. This is, to my knowledge, the first example we're going to have of that.
I think we do have.
We do? Okay. If there's an example.
I think I've seen something like that. There's a pre-run that matches the arguments, etc., etc. So I think I saw something like that.
Yeah, there is support for deprecation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's support for deprecating a command, but we're deprecating a value of an argument.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So when someone uses it, we can print the message. That's pretty easy, but it's not going to appear in help, for instance, like deprecating flags does, and so does deprecating commands.
Yeah.
So
we can update the help test message, I think.
Okay. So updating help, printing out something to standard error when they actually go down the path, and a release note in that pull. Sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah. And then next release, the following release, we'd have another release note saying it's been removed. Awesome.
So let's say after removing this command, is there any use cases where you would like to tweak the parallelism at all for job? And if you want, what would be a way to do it?
Patch.
Patch or just editing directly, whatever.
Update and apply.
That's literally the only field that you can modify once the job is created.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next item. So in the last meeting, there was an action item for publishing 1.10 goals for SIG-CLI. So I took a stab at it, and I basically created this table format where just listings from the main items that were captured in the last meeting notes and just put it out there. So I don't know how do we want to go over it or how much detail we want to talk about it. Phil, do you have any idea?
Of going over the 110 goals.
Yeah. I mean, I just
yeah.
captured these from the last meeting notes.
So yeah, apologies for not sending these out earlier. Originally, I was going to send them out right after the meeting for everyone to add in, but Sunil graciously offered to step in and help me out with this. So I think an action item to everyone in SIG-CLI is to go open this up and look, is your name an owner for something? And if it is, actually confirm that. And then if it's not, and there's something that you're planning on delivering in 110 and should be tracked like in the features process, make sure it's on here. So we can facilitate with all the other parties and make sure everyone is on the same page. I do see plugin enhancements with Fabiano on there. That's probably not correct. Unless he's planning on doing the plugin camper.
No, I just put that names, thinking if there is anything needed, you can fill it in basically. So, okay.
Cool. David, maybe the generic endpoints for sub-resources as scale on here. Is your name the right name to put on there, or is there someone else?
Actually, for scale in particular, that was Polynomial. He's a community contributor, so credit where it's due. And the other commands, I still need to talk in API machinery about it. There was initial resistance because why would you ever want to look at a log for replication controller that can have more than one log is difficult to describe to people who don't look at it and say, you know what, on a CLI, that is a super useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, it's so useful.
it is so useful, and like the semantic, I think, is actually clearly defined for cube control. And yeah, so I'm going to press on it, and that just reminds me that I need to do that. And
okay,
I'll write something up and then cross post.
I'm sorry about that, Polynomial.
Yeah, I don't know if he's on here today, but yeah, he did good work.
All right. I think
question about plugins. Is there an issue that is open that is tracking problems people are having using it? Or is there just the general sense of we have other things we may want to provide there?
Yeah, let me check. So I think we had a couple things that were consumers of plugins had been asking for as features, specifically a management system similar to what Helm has, I think was the suggestion, where it just facilitates downloading and unpacking the TARs and making sure they get them at the right OS version and unpacked to the right plugin directory. Just a little bit of porcelain on top of what a user could do with curl themselves and a couple bash commands. So there isn't any commitment to doing that yet, but there was an ask for it, and so I think we're expecting to see first like a design doc explaining what the user experience would be around that and roughly how it would be built.
Okay. I just want to make sure it wasn't like we have an issue that says it doesn't work, because that would move it up my list.
No, I'm not aware of any issues that say it doesn't work.
Great.
I think the other thing was moving it out of the plugins subcommand so that it has like a more native feel to the experience.
Getting into the whole namespacing problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Namespacing land rush. So
It's true. Cool.
Okay, so I guess then we can move on to the next item in the list. SIG testing framework. Okay.
Oh yeah, I put that one in there, and it's more just an update. In case anyone hasn't looked at it yet, Hannes and Gareth from Pivotal spent the last maybe 3 months or so. Do you know?
Yeah, almost 3 months.
Quarter or so building out a really clean test framework for integration tests. And the intent is for it to be used by anyone developing either tools or extensions. So like if you're building CRDs and controllers, or if you're building other tools such as kubectl, including kubectl, it brings up a control plane for you using just locally within etcd and API server, no nodes, and allows you to just spin those up for each test suite. You can spin up multiple ones in parallel and all that sort of stuff. So if you are building any tools and you want to test them and you need a Kubernetes cluster, this is actually a really clean, lightweight alternative. And if you're developing kubectl commands, I expect that we're going to be moving away from the EDE tests that spin up a full 3-node cluster for most things, and move more to this where you can just run it locally on your desktop, and you don't actually need to check that pods are running on nodes.
Yeah, Phil actually showed me yesterday. It's pretty cool actually. With just 3 APIs, you can actually set up a pretty good test. Okay, so I think we are pretty much done with most of the items that we had on our agenda list. Is there anything somebody would like to talk, or anything that you want to bring up?
actually, I do. About a half hour ago, I encountered a code level problem, but it's pretty pervasive. If there's a moment, I'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, let's add that.
So there is a stage. There is an artifact you can get for an object called a REST mapping. Like I said, this is very nitty gritty. It's code level detail. But you have a REST mapping that says, given this particular object that I have decoded from somewhere, where can I submit it to? Right, server side. What are the valid API resources that it matches? And it also contains information for which kinds should this theoretically be decodable to. I think that all that information logically requires a server to be present or conversion logic to be present inside of the client itself. And so at a code level, I was thinking about trying to separate the concepts and try to limit the number of commands that actually assume that they have conversion logic, find them, isolate them, maybe eliminate them, and then also force commands to tolerate the idea that a REST mapping may not exist. Right? We have -- local on many of our commands, and a local command that requires a server connection doesn't feel very localish.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. There's nothing I disagree with. The parts that I understand, I agree with.
Okay.
Yeah, I was talking to David about that. Mo asked me something about this last night, and I was kind of explaining the history. Like, this predates discovery and predates taping. It's really just, we did most of the transition in 1.9 actually to cut the use of it, but it still kind of needs the final snip. Because we made the mistake of not making schema and resource name match so that you could always submit a schema to the server and the server could say this schema doesn't exist as a primary resource object. We don't have all of the approaches involve things like endpoint sys's and hobbits for like turning schema names from kind into resources, and it in practice doesn't work anyway for CRDs, so might as well cut that now.
Yeah. All right. Then I will look at that. Maybe Juan will have time to start looking at that too, and seeing where we have these odd trip dependencies, because it fails in some weird spots.
Can I ask a quick question when you get a chance? This is Sean from Google.
Sure.
So my understanding is these REST mappings are created from the REST mapper, which is then created from the factory that is generated at the beginning of the command. Is that correct?
There are a couple different wrappers for a REST mapper, but in principle, yeah, we can start there.
And so there's a priority REST mapper, and there's a multi-REST mapper, I believe. So it felt like, especially with the unstructured objects, that without this REST mapping, there was no way, especially if you had a runtime.object, there was no way without the REST mapping to actually get at the fields of a generic runtime.object. The REST mapping has the metadata.assessor, I believe. Does any of this sound familiar, David?
It does. Some of it comes down to, do you believe that a metadata accessor for a locally run command is a thing that can be determined reasonably from a server connection? And I guess on the whole, whether a metadata accessor is actually related to the REST mapping, right? So the metadata that you're trying to get out is inside of the deserialized object that you have, the bytes somehow.
Right.
And when we look at it, there is actually, there are two versions of the metadata. There is metadata v1 and now metadata v1 alpha 1, or is that beta pull merge, Clayton? Either way, there are a limited number of flavors, and the client knows which flavors it understands. So to be able to have metadata access, I don't think it is actually required or can even reasonably be provided by the REST mapping.
Yeah, some of this is historical too. The idea originally was we were going to have these Go types, and then we never really thought about, okay, well, what happens when we don't have the Go types? So we had abstractions in the code, like metadata accessor and REST mapper, that were based around assuming that you're going to have Go types for everything. And obviously, that assumption stopped being valid the moment third-party resources showed up. And then we're further, as we move down this path, most of those things, like what David's talking about, is snipping the underlying dependency on the static and assuming that just because you have a Go type, that talking to the server has anything to do with the Go type you have. Basically, kind of the rule of thumb in the code base today is, if you have a runtime object and it doesn't implement object meta, it doesn't matter. Like, we just treat it as not being object meta. So someone would have to write code that deliberately didn't implement that interface. And at that point, like, that's a coding error. Either you support object meta or you don't. And we really haven't gone back and looked at, like, unstructured doesn't deal with this at all.
Yeah, those are the types of objects that I was mostly dealing with, were unstructured objects, but they were being passed around as runtime.object, which had a very thin interface.
all the helpers do is, I mean, honestly, all that helper does is just try the cast to meta.objectMeta to see whether it satisfies the interface. And I think that's kind of the arc that the code base in practice has to follow. If whoever creates the unstructured object, originally there'd been a thought that like we're going to rev object meta. So we're going to like change fields and all that. And every time we've run up against it, it's come down to there's really no value to it because the implications for the whole Kubernetes ecosystem would be so high that like the small value we would get in splitting fields or renaming them would be overwhelmed by the amount of work and change that it would cause. And so for the most part, object meta is forward compatible only. It is like at some point, maybe in the far, far future, we'll consider changing it, at which point anybody who's generic is basically broken. So
yeah, we should find a new job.
So then is the proposal then to try to get rid of REST mapping, or to it feels like that concept was pretty deeply ingrained into quite a bit of the code.
The degree to which it's ingrained is why I brought it up here and didn't just start opening pulls.
You weren't talking about getting rid of REST mapping.
No, I'm not. But there are many paths that rely on it today that should not, right? Like you absolutely have to have a REST mapping to be able to submit an object to an endpoint. I agree. There's no way around that. But you do not need a REST mapping to be able to retrieve a name from an object. And that's the sort of snip that I'd be looking to make.
Conversion is the ugly one right now, but
it is. I would also assert that conversion is a target to be pulled out of that interface, since conversion is a client concern and not a server one.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question here? How much of this is like well understood and well documented versus like something you know?
How many? Which part? I mean, like the depth of the code.
Yeah. No, so I'll give context to my questions here. You're looking at making some code cleanup changes, and I guess what I'm wondering is new developers who see like REST mappings in the code, like, are we confident that they're not going to introduce these same sorts of problems that you're describing, or do we need like a style guide or something like that that explains appropriate ways to use REST mapping and where to do what?
I think that to a large degree, the changes that I'm looking to make will result in changes to the REST mapping interface, such that some of the original mistakes that we've made over the years can't be replicated unless someone goes through and tries to re-add them. For instance, if I remove an object converter from the mapping object in the builder, we would all notice if somebody tried to add it back.
Right.
In terms of the level of knowledge for these particular pieces, no, that as far as I'm aware is not written down. I'm actually impressed that Sean, I don't know his GitHub ID, but I'm actually impressed that he was able to name like 3 different REST mappers. So go him.
Yeah.
On 3.
This is something we should do more to document it. It gets to like some of the abstractions that were there to kind of let us be somewhat agnostic. Some of them probably can be simplified down now that we have a clearer. Like I think at the heart of that, this is really just saying now that we clearly are going to have less hard coding or less deliberate Go type manipulations and a lot more generic type operations in kube control. Some of the things that supported the static code-based stuff can be reduced, removing some of the Go abstractions with just more general, like we get some JSON back and we do a few things and then send it back over the wire.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with all that.
So, on this same note, really quickly, now that pretty much a number of commands are dealing with external resources, would we need to still convert resources to, say, a versioned resource in the case of printer for mapping? So I know one thing that we definitely should look into is not needing a REST mapper to use the printers. And right now we basically depend on the REST mapper for printers, mainly because you have printer for object, for example, which relies on printer for mapper, and then printer for mapper only uses the REST mapper that is given if you're printing generically, so to JSON or YAML or what have you. But the only reason it does that is to obtain a versioned printer to convert the resource to a versioned resource.
One, I think that the answer is we have general agreement that client-side things that are dependent on conversion should be segregated, and that things that rely on server-side connections should only do so if they actually need the server connection, and everything else that falls out of that sort of flows, right? It'll probably be easier for people if they look at the concrete poles, because you just use the word printer 4 times, and
fair enough.
Yeah.
So what is the action item here, David? Then the next steps?
The next steps, I think that either myself or Juan will go through and start taking a targeted look at which pieces of the REST mapping interface we can slim down and usages that we can identify as improper. We will start pulls and umbrella issues tracking individual items.
Okay.
And if we get something that has significant ripples, we'll be sure to get a wider audience reviewing those particular changes. Things that are small and targeted, I don't know that we need to have a wide audience for, but structural changes certainly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was a good discussion. So, is there anything else that anyone wants to discuss? I think we've still got time.
I'll bring up one thing, which is that in the steering committee, we're looking at SIG governance proposal and how to structure roles. And so I expect maybe in the near future that we will want to look at that and bring in some of the structure it brings, specifically at looking at stuff like where more well-defined roles around technical leadership and also the operational leadership of running the SIG and meetings and stuff.
Okay.
So that's just a heads up.
Okay, so anyone else wants to bring up anything? Or okay, going once, twice. Okay, thank you everyone. This is all for today, and let's meet in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm gonna stop the meeting now. Yeah. Okay.